Now that the maneuvering was over and siege warfare begun, Ogadai left the command with the implacable Subutai. Midsummer heat held the region, and the stout Kakan longed for the cool air of his prairies. He trekked back through the wall, taking Tului with him. After demanding gifts from the Golden Emperor, who now besought him for terms of peace, Ogadai acts characteristically for unexpected things, among them a certain scholar descended from Confucius, and a quantity of girls skilled in making embroidery, with men servants experienced in hunting with falcons, and these were sent him. But Subutai refused to abandon the siege, saying that he had heard nothing of peace. Just after he left the Great Wall, Ogadai was stricken with a deadly sickness. In Yaleu Chautsai's absence, there was no physician to be summoned, and Ogadai called in the Kams, the Shaman Magicians. The Shaman Magicians to drive out the demon that tormented him. The shamans sealed the tent of the sick man and sat down to their drums, and they drew water from a spring, and they swept out the yurt with birch seedlings made into a broom to cleanse the earth. Well, some people are allergic to birch, and that would be a problem. They poured wine and milk of a goat into the water, heating it in a wooden bowl over the embers of a dung fire. With this liquid, they washed the affected parts of Ogadai's body to wash away the demon that had fastened upon the Kakan's flesh. Then Tului, who sat watching in silent anxiety, took the bowl from them. He spoke an invocation to the everlasting sky that its power might heal Ogadai. For Tului believed, as his brother believed, in the magic of the shamans. He drank the liquid in the bowl, saying, "Thou knowest that I have more blood guilt than he, for I have slain more men and made slaves of multitudes. Or," he added, "if it is for his beauty thou seekest him, he is more hideous than I. Let him live as he is, and take me in his stead." Well, a little more graphic than your typical Tom Glenn Buddhist practice, right? It seemed to him quite reasonable if the evil Kalets craved life, they should be satisfied with Tului's as much as Ogadai's, and Tului, who had watched so many thousands die, was terrified at thought of Ogadai dying, but Ogadai recovered, and they resumed their journey toward the Ordu. They had come in sight of the dark hills at the headwaters of the Anan, when Tului sickened swiftly. Within a few days he was dead. The shamans felt justified of their magic. They explained that Tului had drunk the sickness that was in Ogadai, the widow. Ogadai, however, comforted himself by drinking wine. The young brother had gone through the sky, through the gate in the sky. His soldi would be companion with that of the father, which dwelt in the yak tails of the standard. There was no help for it. The smoke still rose from the ancestral hearth in the grasslands by the Kerulan, but the keeper of the hearth had left Ogadai. He experimented with the new wines of Cathay, seasoned with cloves and sugar. When he drank, the coldness left his limbs. Warm blood sang in his head. His feet moved as if they were dancing of their own accord. His ears heard his own voice. At such a time, when he was entirely drunk, the blue wolf of his ancient clan would appear in the yurt, and Ogadai felt a sense of power. The voices of his girls chimed like tiny bells, and their white skin gleamed like smooth satin. Chagatai had come back to the Ordu when the hard-riding couriers brought him word of the Tului's death. Chagatai forbade Ogadai to drink more than 6 goblets a day. The Kakan was too fearful of his elder brother's anger to disobey. Besides, Chagatai told off an officer to be with Ogadai when he ate or drank, to see that he kept to the 6 allotted cups. And Ogadai did keep to them, but he had larger ones made to double the amount of wine and spirits. The officer noticed the change, but said nothing to Chagatai. It was not so easy to evade Yalayu Utsai, the wise Cathayan, knew that drink and dysentery had carried off Tului. Until a generation before, the nomads had drunk little except their inevitable fermented mare's milk. Now, with the jars of liquor stored about them, they craved intoxication. One day, Yalayu Utsai brought his master an iron jar in which spirits had been standing. He showed Ogadai how the iron had been corroded by the spirits. If it does this to iron, he warned, judge for yourself what it must do to your intestines. The demonstration impressed Ogadai, and he drank less. I agreed for Tului, he said, so I drank more than my share of wine. At the Ordu, he often found Si Urkuktiti in his presence. The widow of Tului made no trouble in her mourning. She listened to the shamans and the bonzes who came to console her, and gave them gifts impartially. It stirred Ogadai's heart to see her in mourning. He urged her to ask for anything she wished. He would not deny her. She asked for an officer who served the Kakan to attend her. The man was valuable, and Ogadai did not wish to give him up. Then, with a flash of temper and tears in her eyes, Sir Kuktiti cried, Tului was loved and desired of me. See, for whom hath Tului sacrificed himself? For whom hath he died? Ogadai, troubled, considered, the right is with Sir Kuktiti. Begi, let her forgive me. Her wish is granted. When this reached the ear of Turakina, the first wife of the Kakan, made trouble about it. Was the Kakan, she demanded, like a weak reed to bend at the breath of a woman's anger? Her sharp words made it seem as if Ogadai had been belittled by Sir Kuktiti, and the Kakan made test of Tului's widow. Without consulting her, are the princes of the Golden Family. He gave 2,000 warriors of the Soldus clan to his own son. Then the chieftains of the army who had belonged to Tului, the commanders of thousands and tens of thousands, came together to the yurt of Tului's widow before her sons and the other princes of the Golden Family. Those 2,000 of the Soldus are ours. Soldus are ours, they said, by the mandate of Genghis Khan. Now the Ogadai gives them to his son. How can we endure such a thing? How can we alter the word of the Yerlig of Genghis Khan? Indeed, we shall bring this before the face of the Khan. Sir Kuktiti spoke to them quietly. Truly you have spoken. Ye think, are we lacking in riches that have been handed down to us? No, nor is anything owing to us, and beyond that, the army and ourselves belong now to the Khan. We are his to command, and he knows what must be bidden, and we shall bow to his will. When they heard this, the chieftains stood silent. Everyone who heard was satisfied, especially Ogadai. When shall I see, he demanded of the princes, another among the race of women like to her? For a while he pondered and decided that the fittest thing would be to make an offer of marriage to Sir Kuktiti Begi. He offered to marry her to his eldest son, Kuyuk. It was a tribal custom for a brother or nephew, or at times a son, to take the wives of a man who had died. Kuyuk, Ogadai reflected, was morose and solitary, and troubled besides by the evil callets of sickness. Sir Kuktiti would be a blessing for him, and the marriage would unite his own house with Tului's house. When his envoy made the proposal to Sir Kuktiti, she thanked him, and explained that she had no wish for another husband. How can one do otherwise than to obey the will of the Khan? She said. Yet it is my one desire to bring up these children of mine to manhood, striving to make them mannerly, and keeping them from hating one another, and growing apart, so that out of their fidelity a good work may come. The wish of a mother moved Ogadai greatly. He felt that he should grant her all Tului's heritage, the homeland and the hearth of the Mongols, the nucleus of the first tribes, and the bulk of the veteran army, for he thought her modest and chaste as well as wise, and Siyurkuktiti received her husband's appanage gratefully from his hand, since some of her children were very young when their father died, or she'd said, as she guided them and made every effort to train them and to guard the great chieftains and war clans that they had inherited from Genghis Khan, and these commanders, seeing her equal to all things, never strayed from her ordering. The death of Tului while Ogadai lived had removed her sons from the prospect of leadership in the Golden Family, but Siyurkuktiti had managed to keep them in power, and she herself had become the head of the House of Tului, instinct surer than Yaleu Utsai's sagacity warned her that weaklings could not survive in this new world of the Mongols. Ogadai builds himself a palace. After returning from the Cathay campaign, Ogadai no longer held out against Turakina's importunity. He had quartered himself in the comfortable yamens of Cathay, admiring their courtyards and garden pools, and he did not feel inclined to return to tent life. If Turakina wanted palaces she should have. True, the great ancestor had advised him to keep moving and not to settle down. Ogadai compromised shrewdly. He would have palaces enough to keep moving between them. He bent his thoughts, Rashid relates, to the designing of all types of buildings. For his town residence, he selected the grasslands where a river branched south of Lake Baikal. Here he had a wall of dried mud put up to mark the town site and to corral his horses. It was known as Kara Kurum, Black Walls, and also as the Ordu Baleg, our camp city. Since from the region of Cathay, Rashid explains, he had brought back craftsmen who were masters. He bade them rise up in the yurt of Karakorum, where he liked to reside, a palace, solid of base and lofty of pillar, befitting a monarch such as he. Its sides were the length of an arrow's flight, and they adorned it with paintings and sculptured figures, and he made it his throne seat. Then the order went forth that his brother and son and the other princes of the imperial house were to raise up palaces of their own by it. All of them obeyed, and when these edifices were finished and joined together, great throngs came to look upon them. Then the Khan bade that the most skillful goldsmiths should make festive fountains for the wine hall in the shapes of beasts, such as elephants, lions, and horses. They were filled with wine and mare's milk, and before each one was a basin made of silver, so that the wine and mare's milk would flow out into the basins, and he commanded that each day 500 wagons drawn by 6 oxen and filled with wine, grain, and meat should arrive at his palace and be given out from his storerooms. A day's ride from his desert metropolis of Karakorum, Ogadai built a banquet pavilion. When he was inclined to feast, he would go thither. Only for a month in spring would he reside in his palace. All the people, Rashid says, would put on garments of the same color. For a month he would busy himself with pleasures in the palace, and set open the door of his treasure house to let high and low profit from his bounty. Every nightfall he would put his bowmen and his archers and wrestlers one against the other, and he would flatter the winners and give them gifts. Farther out on the prairie he had Persian artisans, since Karakorum had been trusted to the Chinese, built another palace at a place where he heard the gamekeepers of a long-dead king had dwelt. He visited this in the spring, when the wild beasts were astir after the winter, and he called it Kurt Chagan, the White Wolf, for a summer residence. Ogadai selected a site by the Blue Lake where the wild birds gathered. Here he had a great pavilion pitched, the outside studded with gold and tapestries, hung within a tent that could hold 1,000 people. This he called the Sira or Du, the Golden Camp. The winters he passed at the hunting wall with a large part of the army who served to drive the game. For a month they made a human ring, Rashid relates, to drive the game against the barrier, and the warriors standing shoulder to shoulder in a circle. First Ogadai, with his chosen companions, would enter and amuse himself killing the game. When he was sated, the princes and chieftains would go in order. After the common people and soldiers would hunt until the remaining animals were freed for next year's chase, and the stewards divided up all the game so that no man remained without his portion. After 9 days feasting, each tribe returned to its own yurt. Well, being entertained by the killing of animals rather than, one understands how it branches off into wars of conquest and stuff. The salvage of Cathay, long before Ogadai's palaces were finished in the prairies, the cities of Cathay had crumbled beneath Subbatai's attack. A generation before this, when the Mongols first rode into Cathay, they had avoided the cities, knowing little of siege warfare. Now they had engineers to serve them, to sap and to mine. Around Nanking, Subbatai had built a counter wall, 54 miles in circuit, with wooden towers that rose above the wall of the doomed city. Siege machines creaked and thudded on each wall. The fire pots of the Mongols kept the roofs in the city smoking, but the Cathayans had the ho pa'o, the fire machines that wrought destruction with gunpowder. They thrust long iron tubes through holes in the walls into the Mongol trenches, and the powder in the tubes exploded with a roar, making a black and smoking crater in the earth. The Mongols had a healthy fear of the ho pa'o until they learned how to use the machines themselves. For 6 days, Subbatai assaulted the walls. After captives had piled bunches of brush against them, and human bodies rose with the brush, he sat quietly in his tent, hearing the tidings that were brought to its entrance. He had a thin, reddish beard and small eyes, and the skin was lean on the bones of his head. No written words or maps littered the tent. He carried the plan of the country and the positions of his regiment in his mind, and he was implacable as death itself. A kin general among the captives condemned to death asked to have Subbatai pointed out to him. The Mongol stepped forward. "Thou who hast not a moment to live," Subbatai demanded, "what dost thou wish of me?" "It is not chance but destiny that makes conquerors such as thou," the captive answered. "Having seen thee, I am ready to die." And he was killed. When the attack failed, the Mongol leader waited patiently for starvation to do his work for him. The multitude inside the walls ate what remained of horseflesh and made soup of saddle leather and human bones mixed with green weeds. Flesh was taken from the bodies of the sick and slain prisoners. Then plague thinned the ranks of the living. Subbatai let it be known that he would consider terms of peace, and the kin, snatching at this hope, sent out armfuls of the treasure to him. Whereupon Subbatai did withdraw his forces far beyond sight of the walls. He wanted to rest his men in camps remote from the plague. When he was ready, he attacked again A division of Chinese troops from the Sung Empire aided him. The Qin Emperor, young and stout, bewildered by calamity, wrote to the Sung, "The Mongols have taken Assia and 40 kingdoms. After the Qin will come the turn of the Sung. You do evil in aiding them." This golden emperor was unable to realize that his dynasty had come to an end. At his birth, he had been the overlord of millions who were, in different degrees, his slaves. They had reverenced him as the child of an all-powerful heaven. I'm not sure how literally some of this would have been taken. Now he still wrote verses and amused himself with the music and girls on a pleasure barge among the Nanking until the Mongols drained the lake. Now, Europe had a problem with what they did with children. But I don't think this is what's going on with these people. I think or maybe the author is not distinguishing between young adults and adults that have wrinkles and all that, which is actually probably the likely thing. He left the city with his courtiers to assemble a new army, but he found the other cities ruined or helpless, and he threw himself into a fortress to escape the Mongol horsemen. Women put on the garments of men to defend his life when they heard that the Mongols had broken through the walls of Nanking. And part of the reason why I point this out is because in my country, we have a president that's saying we should tolerate certain cultures and their abuses, basically. Giving up the seal of state, he bade his kinsmen, carry on the dynasty if they survived. Then he ordered the wives who still accompanied him to be slain, and the tower in which he had taken refuge to be filled with straw. Bidding his servants set fire to the straw, he hung himself. Before his servants could sprinkle the waters of oblation over the ashes, the Mongols were swarming through the palace with the Sung soldiers, and the Sung commander carried off a vase of the ashes to take back with him to the imperial temple of the Chinese. The golden emperor, who had longed to write verses, had become a handful of ashes in an inscribed urn. Survivors of his family committed suicide by jumping into the river, or they were hunted down and slain. Well, hopefully the latter, because that would have been better for them. The Qin dynasty had come to an end. It was Yelyu Chutsai who preserved its culture and the surviving human beings who no longer had a protector. Yelyu Chutsai, as usual, had been following where the Mongols looted. Before fire could destroy what they left behind, he and his Chathayan servants gathered up many things tossed aside by the Mongols: sheaves of maps, books of brush paintings, old coins, and always the valuable stacks of rhubarb. When he heard that Nanking had fallen, he hurried to Ogadai and did an amazing thing. He knew that most of the population of Honan had taken refuge in the great city, and he asked the Khan to order his commanders to spare the lives of the several million survivors. Until then, the Mongol army had devastated any walled habitation that resisted it. Subotai was preparing to let his regiments loot and massacre within Nanking. As a matter of course, its stubborn defense enraged the Mongol leaders, and Ogadai refused at first to break the long-established custom. "Do you want to lose?" the Cathayan demanded. "The results of 10 years' warfare? The land of Cathay," he asked. "What was it worth in itself without the inhabitants who raised grain and rice and made silk from worms and mulberry leaves?" Still, Ogadai refused. "Then think of this," his minister argued. "The treasure you have taken from Cathay, the gold, the fine objects, and the splendid iron of its swords and arrowheads, all that is no more than the work of the hands of its artisans. If you put an end to this generation of men, you will get no more treasure made." Ogadai conceded that this was true, and he ordered Subutai to spare the civilian population. The Cathayan armies had been annihilated, with their officers and the members of the imperial family were being exterminated. But the peasant farmers, the artisans of the town, and the scholars survived the storm. Eliu Tsai made certain of that by distributing banners to them inscribed with the Yerlig of the Kakan. He took pains to summon black refugees from the mountains before they could develop into outlaws. And he promised Ogadai that the time would come when he could collect 1,000,000 ounces of silver yearly in revenues from Cathay. Ogadai was satisfied because Yeliu Tsai had never failed to keep a promise, but many of the Mongol nobles at Karum were not satisfied. They had been amazed at first at the amount the yearly taxes brought in. Now they complained to Ogadai that the taxes were too light. If taxes produced so much wealth, why not double the taxes and have twice as much wealth? Government, Yeliu Tsai warned them, must be saving. It could not be avaricious. These taxes, he cried, are already too heavy if they go to enrich grasping men. It needed more than courage to fight the battle Yeliu Tsai was waging for Chinese civilization. Only steel-like purpose, as inflexible as Subutai's, an extraordinary presence of mind, enabled him to convince the conquerors that he was right. Added to that, he had to have at his fingers' ends a knowledge of the countries as great as theirs. Already the Cathayan had established schools in Yenking and elsewhere to teach the boys of the Mongol princes something of geography, astronomy, and history. He explained that it was possible to know things about a country before they visited it, and to anticipate the movements of the planets, to which they paid superstitious heed. Once the teaching began, the Mongols, whose sons were still illiterate, often brought them in to the new schools. Chicken Kuriltai Nuden Unchi. The elder Mongols reminded them, ears deceive, eyes reveal. A period of grim reconstruction set in. The Mongol officers in occupied territory were more than mere governors. They were nomads who cared for only the immediate moment, and most of all for gain. They enforced an agricultural Cathay, the customs of the steppes. If bandits robbed along the highways, they collected the amount of the loss from the nearest villages, and they commandeered horses for the post stations that linked together the new empire. Frequently, the heads of Chinese villages, forced to produce a tax assessment in silver, had to borrow from Muslim moneylenders. Islam forbids charging money at interest, right? Same thing with the interest payments. The Bible condemns it too. In the course of a year, exorbitant interest would double the amount of the debt. If another year passed without payment, the debt and interest would double again, and the usurers would take the farm animals from the community in payment. The people would then abandon their homes or sell their children as slaves, going off to become part of the drifting human tide that began to move in the wake of a war. Yeliu Tsai convinced the Ogadai that these debts of harassed communities ought to be shouldered by the public treasury. These people, he told, the Kakan, are your children.